This summer was supposed to be the start of something new, something thrilling. Turning 18 came with the freedom I had been craving for years. It wasn't just about being able to vote or graduate high school. No, for me, it was all about getting my motorcycle license. Ever since I was a kid, I had dreamed of the day I could finally get my hands on a Harley and hit the open road. So, when I finally passed my driving test, I wasted no time. I got myself a Harley Davidson, a 1976 Ironhead Sportster that I'd saved up for years, and started exploring the countryside with my friends. Every weekend was an adventure. We'd find new back roads to ride, smaller gravel roads that wound through dense forests and over rolling hills, places that felt untouched by time. The hum of the engine beneath me, the wind in my face, and the feeling of freedom. It was everything I had imagined and more. One day, in late July, we decided to take a ride out on some smaller gravel roads we hadn't explored before. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields as we took our time on the winding paths. We rode slower than usual, careful to avoid loose gravel that could send us skidding into a ditch. There was no rush, no destination, just the ride. As the day faded into twilight, the soft oranges and pinks of the sunset gave way to the deep blue of night. By the time we decided to head home, the sky was ink black, and the only light came from the pale crescent moon hanging low on the horizon. We found our way back to a highway, an empty stretch of road that cut through the countryside like a black ribbon. The speed limit was 70 mph, but I decided to take it easy, keeping a steady pace, just enjoying the cool night air and the rhythmic thrum of the Harley beneath me. 15 minutes passed, and I settled into the ride, the world around me reduced to the narrow beam of my headlight cutting through the darkness. The road was completely deserted. It was just me and the night. And then I saw it. A car, parked on the side of the road, its hazard lights flashing dimly in the distance. As I approached, I felt a twinge of unease, but I told myself it was nothing. People broke down all the time, especially on these old country highways. Still, as I got closer, something about the scene didn't sit right. The car was old, a beat-up sedan that looked like it had seen better days. There were no other cars around, no sign of anyone in trouble, and it was nearly 3 a.m. When I was just a few yards away, the driver's door suddenly opened, and a man stepped out. He moved with a strange, jerky motion, like he wasn't used to being in his own skin. His clothes were stained, no, drenched, in what looked like blood. It was smeared across his shirt, his arms, even splattered on his face. And then I saw his eyes. Wide, bloodshot, with a look of pure madness. He was grinning, a sick, twisted smile that stretched too far across his face, as if it were painted on. I sped up instinctively, my heart pounding in my chest. The man didn't move as I passed him. He just stood there, grinning, his eyes locked on mine. For a moment I thought I was imagining things, that maybe the darkness and my tired mind were playing tricks on me. But then I glanced in my mirror, and my blood ran cold. The man was back in his car, and he was following me. He was gaining on me quickly, and before I knew it, he was right alongside me, his car matching my speed. I could see him clearly now, his blood-covered hands gripping the steering wheel, his face still twisted in that horrible grin. His eyes never left me, wide and wild, and filled with something that I can only describe as madness. He drove beside me for what felt like an eternity, though it could only have been a minute. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Who was this guy? What had he done? And why was he here, on this empty highway, in the dead of night, covered in blood? Then, without warning, he turned his head toward me, and his grin widened. He lifted one hand off the wheel and waved at me, a slow, deliberate gesture, like we were old friends parting ways. But it was what he did next that chilled me to the bone. He raised his finger to his lips and made a shush motion, as if telling me to keep quiet, to not tell anyone what I had seen. Then he floored it, his car roaring to life as he sped off onto a smaller road, disappearing into the night. I watched as his taillights faded into the distance, my heart still pounding in my chest. For a few moments I just sat there, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. The highway was silent again, the only sound the distant chirping of crickets. I wanted to believe it was some kind of sick prank, but deep down, I knew better. The blood on that man's clothes had been real, and so had the look in his eyes, the look of someone who had done something terrible. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to turn around, to follow him, to see where he went and what he was up to. But the smarter part of me, the part that valued my life, knew better. I had to get out of there. I twisted the throttle and sped down the highway, my mind racing faster than my bike. I didn't stop until I was back in the city, the bright lights and familiar streets a welcome relief from the darkness of that country road. I never told anyone about what I saw that night. Not my friends, not the police, no one. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I did, something terrible would happen, that the man with the crazy eyes would find me, and this time, he wouldn't just wave goodbye. To this day, I still don't know who he was, or why he was covered in blood, or what he had done. But every time I'm out on the road, especially at night, I can't help but glance in my mirrors, half expecting to see those bloodshot eyes staring back at me, grinning as he raises his finger to his lips and whispers, "Shush." It's been a year since I first noticed him. A man who seemed to blend into the background of my life until the day he didn't. I don't know his name, his story, or what brought him into my orbit, but I remember the first time I became aware of his presence as if it happened yesterday. I was on my way to work, the same route I'd taken every day for the past 3 years. My mornings were a monotonous routine of getting up, grabbing coffee, and heading out the door. But that morning, something was different. As I pulled out of my driveway, I saw him standing across the street, leaning against a lamppost. He was an older man, maybe in his 50s, with a gaunt frame that suggested he wasn't in the best of health. His face was pale, drawn, and his eyes were shadowed by deep-set lines that made him look perpetually tired. He was dressed in a black jumpsuit, nothing flashy or out of the ordinary, just a plain, unassuming outfit. He didn't do anything to catch my attention, really. He was just standing there, staring off into the distance. I wouldn't have given him a second thought if I hadn't seen him again later that day. I was coming out of a store in the neighboring town, and there he was, sitting on a bench near the entrance. He didn't acknowledge me, didn't look at me, or do anything suspicious. But there was something about him, something unsettling in his constant presence. He was there again the next morning, standing in nearly the same spot as before, and again later that afternoon, as I went for a walk around the block. I started seeing him everywhere, in the grocery store, on the bus, at the local coffee shop. Always in that same black jumpsuit, always with that same expressionless face. He never approached me, never spoke a word. He was just there. I told myself it was just a coincidence. After all, we lived in the same neighborhood. It wasn't impossible that we would cross paths now and then. But the more I saw him, the less I believed it was just happenstance. It wasn't like he was following me. I never saw him close enough to think he was stalking me, and he never tried to make contact. But his presence felt persistent, like a shadow that lingered just outside my field of vision. No matter where I went, he always seemed to be in the periphery, always at a distance, yet always within sight. It wasn't long before I started feeling paranoid. I'd catch myself looking over my shoulder, scanning crowds for his familiar figure. I'd walk a little faster whenever I thought I saw him, my heart picking up speed as the anxiety set in. I even began altering my routine, leaving the house at different times, taking different routes to work. But it didn't seem to matter. He was always there, always on the edge of my life, like a figure in the background of a photograph. I started to question my own sanity. Was I imagining it? Was this some kind of bizarre coincidence, or was something more sinister at play? I didn't want to sound crazy, so I didn't tell anyone about it. What would I say? That a man in a black jumpsuit kept appearing in my life, but only at a distance, never close enough to be a threat, but always there, watching. It sounded ridiculous, even to me. The turning point came one evening when I was driving home from work. It had been a long day and I was exhausted, looking forward to nothing more than collapsing on the couch and zoning out in front of the TV. As I turned onto my street, I saw him again, walking down the sidewalk, moving in the same direction as my car. My heart skipped a beat, and I slowed down, watching him as I drove past. He didn't look at me as I passed, didn't acknowledge my car, or change his pace. But then, as I parked in my driveway and turned off the engine, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. He stopped walking. He just stood there, in the middle of the sidewalk, his back to me. And then slowly, he turned his head and looked directly at me. His eyes locked onto mine through the windshield, and for the first time, I felt like he really saw me. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, neither of us moving. His face was unreadable, his expression still that same blank slate, but his eyes were filled with something I couldn't quite place. Was it recognition? Curiosity? Malice? I didn't know, and I didn't want to find out. I grabbed my bag and bolted out of the car, rushing into the house without looking back. I slammed the door behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the encounter over and over in my mind. What did he want? Why was he everywhere I went? And why had he looked at me like that? I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That a man kept appearing in my life, but he wasn't doing anything illegal, just existing in the same spaces as me? As the days went on, I saw him less and less. He seemed to fade from my life as suddenly as he had appeared, and eventually, I stopped looking for him. But the memory of those encounters stayed with me, a nagging doubt at the back of my mind. Was it all just a coincidence? Or had he been following me, for reasons I would never understand? I never saw the man again after that night, but sometimes, when I'm walking alone or sitting in a crowded place, I'll feel that same prickle of unease, that sense of being watched. And I'll find myself scanning the crowd, looking for a familiar figure in a black jumpsuit, wondering if he's still out there, somewhere, watching me from a distance. In October 2022, I landed an office job that I was really excited about. It wasn't anything glamorous, just a sales position in a small, local company. But it was a steady paycheck and a chance to get my foot in the door of the corporate world. For the first couple of weeks, things were as normal as they could be. I spent my days answering calls, helping customers, and trying to wrap my head around the company's sales strategies. It was the usual grind, but I liked it well enough. I enjoyed the routine, the familiarity of the office space, and the camaraderie with my colleagues. Then came June, and with it, a strange encounter that has stuck with me ever since. It was a typical Tuesday afternoon, and the office was bustling with activity. Phones were ringing, people were talking, and I was at my desk, buried in paperwork, when a man walked in. He was in his late 30s, well-dressed in a casual, put-together kind of way, with a confident air about him. He approached my desk with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes and asked if I could help him find some children's clothes. He mentioned it was for his kid's birthday, and he wanted something special. The request was odd, because our company didn't sell clothes, let alone children's clothes. We specialized in office supplies and promotional products. I told him as much, expecting him to thank me and leave. But instead he lingered, asking more questions. what other stores in the area might carry what he was looking for, if I knew any brands that were popular with kids, that sort of thing. His persistence put me on edge, but I kept my tone polite and professional, trying to steer the conversation back to the products we actually sold. The man's questions grew more personal, though, and he asked about my background, how long I'd been working there, and if I had any kids of my own. The whole interaction felt off, like he was fishing for information, and it made me uncomfortable. I lied, telling him I'd only been in town a short while and didn't have any kids, which wasn't entirely untrue. I had only moved for the job, after all. Then he asked if I had a phone number or social media account where he could reach me in case he needed more help. That's when the alarm bells really started ringing. I gave him a vague excuse, saying I wasn't comfortable sharing personal information with customers, and quickly wrapped up the conversation. He left without buying anything, just giving me that same unsettling smile as he walked out the door. I tried to shake off the encounter and get back to work, but something about it nagged at me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was just something wrong about the whole situation. A few days later, I was working my usual shift when I noticed him again. This time he wasn't alone. He was standing near the entrance, just outside the glass doors, with a small group of men. They weren't doing anything overtly suspicious, just talking quietly among themselves. But I couldn't help but notice that none of them seemed to have wives or kids with them, which struck me as strange, given the area was mostly frequented by families. As I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine, I saw it. One of the men raised a phone and pointed it in my direction. He was taking photos of me. At first, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I thought maybe I was overreacting, that maybe he was taking a picture of something else. But then I saw him zoom in, focusing the camera directly on me. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned away, pretending not to notice. But inside, I was freaking out. Why was he taking pictures of me? What was he planning to do with them? The next hour felt like an eternity. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting the man to walk in again, to start asking more questions or worse. But he didn't. He and his friends eventually walked off, disappearing into the crowd outside, leaving me with a cold, sinking feeling in my stomach. I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. I went straight to my boss and told him everything. The man asking about children's clothes, the personal questions, and then the photos. I tried to explain it without sounding paranoid, but my boss's expression grew more serious with every word. He didn't dismiss my concerns, which I was grateful for. Instead, he nodded and said he'd look into it, maybe check the security footage to see if there was anything to worry about. He tried to reassure me that it was probably nothing, just some weird guy with a camera, but I could tell he was as uneasy about it as I was. He even asked if I wanted to take the rest of the day off, but I declined, not wanting to seem like I was overreacting. That evening, as I walked home, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that man again, lurking in the shadows. I had been fighting off a bad flu for a week, and the stress of the encounter wasn't helping. I was covered up, shivering slightly from both the illness and the fear gnawing at my gut. Once I got home, I sat on my bed staring at my phone. I didn't have his number, didn't know his name, didn't have any way to trace him. The only thing I could do was hope. Hope that he would delete the photos, that this would be the end of it, that I wouldn't see him again. But deep down, I knew the chances were slim. People like that don't just disappear. They leave you with an unease that lingers, that stays with you long after the initial shock has worn off. It's been a while since that incident, and I haven't seen the man again. But every time I walk into work, every time I see a man standing alone, I can't help but feel a twinge of fear. I keep hoping that was the last I'll ever see of him, but some part of me, the part that's been marked by his gaze, knows that I'll never really be sure.